Hey, great to be with you on Wednesday, midweek. Here we're having a little conversation. My name is Dave, and this is Dave.
Dave also, yes.
That's right.
Yeah, so Dave and Dave show.
That's right. So we're starting to have a little bit more of a conversation based on this series that we're going through called Gospel. What is the gospel? How do we live it out? How does it live in us? We just want to keep the conversation going with this little conversation, this little midweek touch point, if you will.
Yeah.
So David, this is, I would love for you to kind of share a little bit of the vision of this time as we're coming into this series and talking about the gospel and what we want this to sort of look like.
Yeah, for sure. You know, when we think about our church experience or the rhythm of church, right? Mm-hmm. We often think about the weekend and, kind of checking in and attending service, but we don't really think about the fact that this really is a call to a daily kind of journey and experience with God and walking with Him, right? And so I love the fact that, we're kind of talking about this midweek touch point where we can keep the conversation going. And the conversation that we're talking about is this kind of share spiritual conversation. Mm-hmm. So often I think we think about our Christian faith and we think it's, certainly personal.
Yeah.
But often we kind of get to this place where we want to be private about our faith.
Right.
But if you read through Scripture and you see the design of the church in its essence, it really is an invitation to connect with others,
right.
To experience community, to be able to connect with God through that, right?
Yeah.
And so that aspect I think is so important. And I know many of us are tuning in or attending church, and joining in on that conversation. Well, it's our desire for us to be able to come in the middle of the week where so much is happening and just keep us connected, keep that conversation going.
Yeah, I think I remember it was a seminary professor of mine that said Paul would have been very confused by if we had asked Paul, do you have Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior? He would have been like, personal? What do you mean? Following Jesus is communal.
That's right.
Right? But we live in an individualized society, right? So I mean, even the way we raise our kids is very much like we want them to be independent and be their own person. So we very much take that into our faith, where it becomes, how do I make my faith my own?
So good.
But it really needs to be collective in order to be truly the gospel.
Yeah. The personal part is true because nobody can believe for me.
Sure.
It is my decision, right? Like, I can't believe for my kids. I'm praying and doing my best to introduce my kids to experience God and encounter Him, come to a place in their life where they say, hey, this is my decision.
Right.
But while that is personal, the best part of really living out our spiritual life so often happens in the context of community with others. And so, that's why church is so important and why we gather corporately on this, regular rhythm of coming once a week, right? But we also know so much happens from weekend to weekend, from Sunday to Sunday, and we know that Monday through Saturday, that's where life is really lived. And we just want to make sure that our spiritual conversation isn't just compartmentalized maybe, or put aside in a silo, where this is my spiritual thinking, these are spiritual truths. And then here's kind of the life, where things happen, right?
Right.
We want to see the converging integration of that. Absolutely.
Yeah. And we're seeing even that in sort of our, the trends of society and a little bit of how we're seeing a lot of people, I mean, COVID obviously, played a part in that, but people dropping away from church attendance, right? Whether it's online or they're, in person or not, but we're seeing sort of a drop in that, but yet people still desire meaning in life, a depth to life. There's still a value for belief and faith, and there is a value for the integration. I think people don't want to compartmentalize everything,
That's right.
But at the same time, there's so much blurred lines that even working from home and your home life is your work life, and there's less. I think people are looking for a sense of boundaries, but at the same time, like integration, not walls. And I think that is the same idea when it gets into our faith, where it's like, what does it look like for me to be a plumber and a Christian, or a nurse and a Christian, or like whatever? How do I integrate my life and faith at the same time? So I think we're seeing the same thing happen in the church.
Yeah, for sure. I love what Dave Adamson talks about, this idea that, when they look at statistics and they see people going to church less and less, or, churches declining in numbers, and, they say, hey, church is kind of shrinking.
Yeah.
He says church isn't decreasing in numbers, it is dispersing in the way that we experience church, right? And so often, the way we used to experience church maybe 30 years ago was, everything happened at that one local church. Today, I'm listening to messages from multiple favorite, communicators or pastors. We're listening to music from all different sources. We're even experiencing community engagement with different groups that are, lining up to my passion, right? And so in some sense, that's actually a really great trend to see.
Sure.
Because we're seeing kind of this idea of the church larger than just a small collection of people. But at the same time, what we're missing, or what could be a danger in that, is that while we're enjoying all the quality and the excellence of church experience, we're becoming less and less known. And I think that's the thing about local church, where, man, somebody knows you by name.
Yeah.
Hey, they know what happened last week and the conversation they had with you, and they've been praying for you. And how do you pick that up, right?
Yeah.
And so much of that is actually missing in our spiritual walk. And so that again is that communal aspect of it, where we're supposed to be challenged, encouraged, and just really helped along the way, because in experiencing spiritual life that way,
Yeah.
I think the very best of us are discovered.
Well, all the more the challenge with online community,
That's
to build
right.
that
That's
community,
right.
because
Yeah.
it feels not natural, right? Because our natural communication is face to face and in person, but we live obviously in a technological age that
true.
it is the same. I mean, I do spiritual direction, and the times that I do spiritual direction with whether I'm receiving it or giving spiritual direction, I do it on Zoom a lot, and I actually see significant impact and movement both in my own life and in the people that I'm spiritually directing. So we know that absolutely there's real authentic community happening over digital space, but it doesn't feel as I guess natural to us in that same way, right? Which is this,
Yeah, you tie that in beautifully to your original question, which was, what's the vision behind this, right? And because, we see different challenges, or maybe the unique challenge of this season, which is that, we can parse out different aspect of our spiritual experience and journey. And even though we may feel like we're downloading a lot of content, checking up on the latest messages, staying connected, if you will, you could at the very same time be very disconnected and isolated.
right.
And so I love the vision of this space for us to be able to say, hey, let's check in on one another.
Yeah.
Let's keep the conversation going. Let's remember that there's something bigger that we're all a part of, right? The other aspect, and I get this question a lot as an online campus pastor, is what's the strength of digital and what's the strength of in person? There's something about that share experience that when we come together in person, face to face, there's something that can never really replace that, right? But also at the same time, even in the early church, this idea that we engage, we experience, we learn on our own. Sometimes we use the educational language, or words like
What's the words?
synchronous and
Okay.
asynchronous,
There
right?
you go.
Like synchronous is learning with others, kind of in that share kind of experience, right? Asynchronous is learning on my own time, in my own kind of space, right? Digital really actually thrives in that, asynchronous kind of learning. If you look at the church and its design, though, most of it has been designed to really come together in a synchronous learning.
Right.
Everything is about the weekend. Everything is about kind of gathering as people, which is important, but digital allows us actually to really then engage in a meaningful conversation with people as they are really growing asynchronously
Right.
in their spiritual journey.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the early church, they were every day together, right? So
That's
I mean,
right.
so
That's
it
right.
wasn't just a
Yeah.
weekend experience; it was every day. So the idea of there being any sort of asynchronistic or individual space, that's again why Paul would be like, "What are you talking about, personal?" But so it's not right or wrong, right? It's just different. We live in a different society now that says, "Okay, how do we make it more than the weekend?" And so, like you're saying, keeping the conversation going. So let's keep the conversation going and talk a little bit about what Rusty kind of highlighted this last weekend in kicking off this series, Gospel. And he talked a lot about sort of misconceptions, right?
Yeah.
That we start off with, what is the gospel? And even the Christian faith. There's misconceptions about walking in the Christian faith, that it is just a Sunday thing. Or, I mean, literally, I just came from the dentist, and the dentist asked me what I do, or the person cleaning my teeth. She's like, do you have work today? I said, yeah. And she said, well, what do you do? And I said, I work at the church. I'm a pastor. She said, do you have like hours? Like, what do you mean? Don't you just work on Sunday? Right? Yeah. So the idea of like, there's still a misnomer even about even what a pastor does, or about online, church, or whatever. There's constant misconception, or even what's in the Bible, as Rusty talked about, things like, let go and let God, which is one of the most cringy statements, that we sometimes say in our vernacular. And it's not from the Bible, right?
Yeah.
We get the principle, but that we have all these misconceptions that come into this. And so what sort of stuck out from what Rusty was sharing this last weekend for you?
Yeah. You know what I was thinking about when he was talking about the misconceptions that people have, or why people kind of catch on to the cliche, sayings, or, the memorable kind of phrases, right? These misconceptions in themselves are not wrong per se.
Sure.
But I think the accurate statement for me would be that they're incomplete. Mm-hmm. In other words, God is inviting us to live a new kind of way of life, right?
Yeah.
But if we see that as a process where we're trying to get God to do something for me, or I'm trying to get to a certain destination, that's when it starts to move from relationship to religion. I love what Tim Keller says when he says, the order of the Ten Commandments coming after the acceptance of Israel as his people is super important. Because if you get that flipped,
sure,
Ten Commandments really is a prescription to
right.
somehow get into good grace of God.
Yeah. How you
versus if he chose me, if he actually expresses his love and acceptance for me before anything, then the way I live now is a response, the direct response to this unconditional love. And how do I live that out? How do I live that truth in a way that I begin to experience and see and pursue the best kind of life, right?
Right. Which ends up really the culmination of what he was talking about was sort of how do we find the freedom that we all long for, that we all desire? Because when we think of the gospel, or we think of being a Christian, or think of God or Jesus, sometimes we think there's so much restriction or constriction. When the whole idea is, I mean, it's all about freedom, and it's all about, being set free. And it reminds me actually, and I thought of this story today because we're in the middle of, day by day, close to putting our dog down. I mean, it's our 16-year-old dog, and he's on bonus time right now. I mean, we were very close to pulling the trigger there, but. So he's in bonus time, but I was thinking about, dogs and we have a lot of stories of rescuing dogs, but we had a pastor on staff that told this story years ago. And when he was a kid, there was a dog that was trapped in like this kind of under the porch. It wasn't trapped, it was kind of caged there. So all the neighborhood boys, him and his friends, were like, we got to rescue that dog. And so they, set up a plan, and, at midnight tonight, we're going to go out and ride our bikes and whatever, this whole thing. He told the story much better than I am now. But they get there, they finally like open the door for the dog, and they run away, like ready for him. They set him free, like he's ready to go. And the dog didn't move. The dog never left. Because he was comfortable in the restriction, in the space that said, no, this is the only life I know. It's the only life I need to live. It's all I got. And the idea of freedom was actually more terrifying than staying where he was.
That's such a good point.
And I think that's the misconception of following Jesus, or saying yes to Jesus, this invitation to, being a part of the community, and not just this personal faith thing, but actually stepping out in vulnerability. And as I was sharing with you before, like, someone shared with me that it's easy for us to sometimes be transparent but not vulnerable. And that's been sitting with me as she said that, because I think that's so true, right? Like I can be transparent about things that are okay to talk about or that are healed stuff. But to be vulnerable, that's a scary place, and it really is only you're vulnerable in community. You're not vulnerable by yourself, right? And so it's all that it's all that space connected.
Yeah. I mean, you're going to be vulnerable to the degree that you know that you're loved and valued.
Yeah.
Right? And so you have to feel safe to be able to take that chance. I love that illustration about freedom. Like, the good news wasn't good news to everybody, you know, because for King Herod, this news that the Son of God was going to be, you know, born was threatening news for him because it directly had implication about his kingship, right? And the kingdom
power.
that he, the power that he possesses, right? And so, you know, like this idea of freedom isn't always that I get to do whatever I want. I think sometimes we think freedom and it's like, okay, I'm free to be, I'm free to do.
Sure.
Like a couple of weeks ago, Rusty showed us his beautiful golf swing on the stage, right? If you've ever taken golf lessons or you've played golf, you know how unnatural that feels. But then if you look at somebody like Tiger Woods, right? Like you see him swing and it just looks so natural and effortless. And I think that's where that idea of freedom in that restriction is such an important idea for us, even in spirituality.
Yeah.
Because we almost don't know what's best for us. And, you know, when God begins to bring that aspect into it, and we trust him, and we begin to move in that direction, freedom is on the other side of that, right?
And I'm blanking on how Paul phrases this, but the idea of just because it's allowed does not mean it's beneficial.
That's right.
I'm blanking on the actual scripture, what it is.
I
but
mean,
you know what I'm talking about.
all things are permissible.
Just because it's permissible does not mean it's beneficial.
We are authentic here. You know?
I couldn't remember the word
conversation.
permissible. Exactly. But the other piece of that was that unpacking a little bit around identity, and you know, really going into that's what really struck a chord with me was the idea that you know, we in order to discover who we really are, we have to know whose we are first, right? And that's where the true freedom comes in being able to recognize, gosh, I can be free to be me because I'm loved fully, and that goes to this prayer that Rusty shared with us, right? And that's sort of this practice that we can implement, which is, you know, he gave us this prayer of that, you know, Jesus, thank you that there's nothing I can do that would make you love me anymore, and nothing I have done that makes you love me any less, right? I mean, that's freedom and that's identity.
Yeah, so good. Yeah, I mean, you know, the whole idea, and we had a conversation around this, right, is that, you know, our journey to know who we are is not independent of this idea that there is a truth and a reflection of us genuinely from external source, right?
Yeah.
And so if whose I am says that I am the byproduct of our culture, then our culture is going to define what's the most important things about me. You know, the true reflection of me, right? And I am pursuing that without even knowing, to somehow be validated in that, you know, from that perspective, right? Well, if we know that we belong to God and what he says is the most important thing, and I think that's where it really is the foundation once again, because what God says about us is not conditioned on what we're doing, what we've done, what we're potential of doing.
Right.
It's not fickle and, you know, fragile like culture is. You know, you're in one day, you're out the next. You know, we live in this constant fear of somehow belonging, being acceptable. Well, God says, I am same yesterday, today, and forevermore.
Yeah.
And from my perspective, from this eternal perspective, I see infinite value in who you are, and I receive you, right? If we can really internalize that, I think it really does have the potential to change everything.
Yeah.
Because if we don't give God the place to be able to speak that truth, we're going to give it to something else or someone else.
Right.
And we know how tiring and, you know, just the endless pursuit that it becomes.
Right, yeah. That's why I have such love for the Enneagram. We've talked about it before, that as an Enneagram coach, it's it really starts, you can discover sort of a depth of who you are, not because the assessment tells you that, but Richard Rohr calls it, we sort of live life as a floating self. Meaning like kind of what we thought we knew of ourselves, right? You're talking about like what culture has said, or my giftings, or what I'm good at, or what I've accomplished. It's our floating self, right? But when we start to really understand who we are, that's the anchored self, right? It's a sense of like, oh gosh, this is there's a depth. It's not false and true, right? It's anchored versus floating. It's not that the things that are gifts and talents and passions, that's absolutely part of who you are. But the way that we think that that's what earns us or gets us to a certain level or degree of like, this is who I am, meaning my job or my spouse or my kids or whatever. But the anchored self says, no, it really starts with how has God created me in the image of God, and having that freedom to live out who I am, really, really is what sets it up. And so, I think this prayer is a great way for us to, just as we sort of kind of wrap this time up of saying, hey, how do you just put this prayer into, not just in front of you, but in you, right? And so whether that's putting it on a Post-it note or writing it, on your kitchen, wherever, just putting it somewhere that you can see it, so you can go, okay, I want to remind myself that it's not about what I do. It loves me no matter what I've done, all that stuff, right? Being able to let that really sink in is sort of what we want for people.
Yeah, no, I love that. Just a constant reminder. Again, not a reminder as a checklist to do.
Not a chore.
Not a chore.
Yeah.
But, as a timely, maybe intentional prompt as we go throughout the day.
Yeah.
Hey, because we so easily can drift, as we just recently talked about, right? Like, let's anchor ourselves to this unchanging truth. That this is who we are. This is how God views us. And it may be the most important thing about us. And if that is true, then how does that now help me to go through my day in a little bit different way, right?
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Well, this has been encouraging. I hope that you were encouraged as well, and being a part of this conversation, and whatever thoughts that maybe hearing, David and I kind of chat through this, that maybe you have questions that popped up, and so we'd love for you to reach out. And let's continue the conversation. Keep it going. We want you to be part of the conversation, and so we invite you to be a part of that. And so I'm excited for this next week for part 2 of Gospel. We have Kevin Finkbeiner sharing with us on what is the title? Joy.
It's what does true joy feel like? Yeah.
I'm curious. I've got an idea, but I'm curious as to what is. What that means. Yeah.
It's kind of like my wife, she just loves Kevin and his teaching. And so, she's like looking forward to it. But when we think about the power that Rusty talked about, I think some of the ways in which that power is manifested or, it's experienced, it really comes in the form of joy. Like if you know that there's this joy around you, no matter what kind of circumstances or season that you're going through, I think that's a good indicator that I'm really anchoring myself to this truth, right? And so really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, because joy is an anchor, whereas happiness feels a little bit more of a floating, circumstantial thing. And so, I'm looking forward to that too, and diving more into that. So, well, we'll see you this weekend for part 2 of Gospel, and then join us next week, again, as we continue the conversation from that message. So until then, be well, be blessed, be the church.